to you, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? We're not switched on? Ah, we are switched on now. Thank you very much for your patience. I often find that the build-up with the microphones is sometimes unbearable, but it is really worth it because we have with us today the who's who of biography. This is a really interesting session because it's called Shadow Play, and sometimes the titles are so poetic I find it hard to find the meaning, but shadow play is a really good, I think, word to use because very often authors who are trying to bring to life somebody either that you don't know or somebody who is long dead are having to deal with and grapple with shadows, things intangible, things hidden in boxes of dusty notes or archives or even reading in between the lines of letters and diaries. So I think it is really like trying to get as many shadows as you can and build them into something substantial. It is my very great pleasure to introduce some of the best in the business, to tell you the truth. Lucy Hughes Hallet, you all know, she has done an awesome work of bringing Cleopatra to life, somebody that we think that we know, thanks to the, well, endless film and comic and cartoon interpretations of the woman. Jenny Uglow, somebody described her to me as the woman who is of millions, millions of children, millions of books, millions of successes, but she really has. She's dealt with people as diverse as Hogarth, Thomas Bewick, Mrs. Gaskell, Charles II. Jung Chang, I know, needs very little introduction in this part of the world, apart from a definitive work on Chairman Mao. She has also brought to life the Dowager Empress Cixi, which is a really, truly interesting work, not just about a woman, but about the times that she lived in. Kate Summerscale here is, well, she's a particular, I've got a soft spot for Kate, because one of her books made me think that I might be able to write something and then in the same breath think I could never write anything as good, because her Queen of Whale Key I found just such a wonderful book about a woman I'd never heard of, who she had discovered and who read the most epic of lives. And then we have, on the end, our token male. Can we have a round of applause for the only man on stage? It can be quite frightening up here, can't it, Mark? Surrounded by women.
Terrifying.
It's like the third session you've done, surrounded by ovaries. But thank you very much for keeping your cool. But Mark Gevisser has written a work about a living person, Thabo Mbeki. So a real spread of characters. Let's just start with how you actually find your person, because I know, particularly Kate, with you, it was one of those lightning bolt moments while doing something completely different, wasn't it?
Yes, in a way. I was working on the obituaries desk at the Daily Telegraph when I was in my 20s, and we every day wrote about people that we'd never met, often had never heard of, and the pieces were published anonymously. And it fell to me just by chance to write the obituary of a woman called Marion Carstairs, whose goddaughter wrote to us saying she might be of interest. She died aged 93, and she had once been a famous motorboat racer. And so I looked in the Telegraph library, the newspaper library, and pulled out all these cuttings about her glory days as a motorboat racer. She was the fastest woman in the world on water in the 1920s. And discovered that she was a really sort of astonishing character. She dressed as a man throughout, smoked cheroots, partied with actresses, built extraordinary boats as well as raced them, and ended up ruling an island in the Bahamas, which she bought. She was a millionairess, and she commanded about 500 black Bahamians and created a little kingdom of her own. So I wrote the obituary. It was only about 1,000 words, and afterwards it just sort of niggled at me how much was unsaid in the newspaper articles, and how a character as sort of brilliant and strange as this could have slipped through the net and become completely unknown. And so I set about trying to find out more about her.
Yeah. And Mark, with yours, I mean, not only was he alive, he was a mammoth figure in South African politics. You yourself are a journalist based in South Africa. And always, I thought, a really hard-to-know man. I mean, I've interviewed him once before, and I could not get the measure of him at all.
So in a way, that's why I did it, Anita. As well as being the only man on this panel, I think I'm the only one who can't put with confidence the word biographer on my calling card. So I'm not a this is the only biography I've written, this biography of Thabo Mbeki. I'm a journalist, and I'm a biographical journalist. I write, and I've written about the South African transition. And Nelson Mandela was fading, and the man in his shadows who was due to fill his shoes, and in fact who had been running the country since Nelson Mandela came to power as Mandela's de facto prime minister. It's a little bit of a Nehru-Gandhi relationship. Was coming into power, and everybody said, "Who is this man? He's an enigma." And to a journalist, that was just a challenge I couldn't resist. Let me see if I can find out who he is. And I was commissioned by a newspaper to write a series of biographical essays about who he was. And in so doing, I sort of fell in love not with him, but with his story, and particularly with his 91-year-old mother, who is this extraordinary woman, a really extraordinary woman who lived in the countryside and who came from one of the first families of what could be called black Englishmen, the first families to become Christian, to become educated, and who were in their day in the late 19th century a real elite in South Africa. And I realized that by telling the story of Thabo Mbeki, I could tell a big story about the 20th century in South Africa and the dispossession of a particular class of kulaks, of South African black kulaks.
Well, it's really interesting because I think that is very, very true for this side in particular, that you don't just tell the story of a person, you end up telling the story of the world, really, in which they live, and the society and the politics. And you happened upon two people that there are great and very deep passions in China about. I mean, Mao, for a start, I suppose, most people tremble to think, God, I've got to do something, I'm really driven to do something about him, because everyone thinks they know and everybody has a strong feeling already. What made you overcome that fear?
Well, I think before I wrote my biography of Mao, I wrote the memoir about my family, my grandmother, my mother, and myself, Wild Swans. And then when Wild Swans was published in the early 1990s, I became a writer, thanks to the book. And then I started to think about my next subject. And Mao seemed to be the obvious subject because I grew up under Mao. I was born in Mao's China. I grew up under him. I left just after he died. And so he dominated my early life. And I saw him turning a quarter of the world's population, their lives upside down. And yet I felt the world knew astonishingly little about him. You know, in China today, his portrait is on Tiananmen Gate. His corpse is in the center of Chinese capital for people to worship. His face is on every Chinese banknote. And yet, when I was writing Wild Swans, I found there were so many questions I couldn't answer. So I thought, you know, that to write a biography, I'm sure you agree, is the best way to understand this person. That's how I started.
But there'll be more scrutiny, I think, of a figure like Mao, who codifies an entire belief system in a huge part of the world than there would, you know, about a historical writer or a poet or somebody like that. That must be quite an intimidating thing, that you're writing a book, there are so many others written about this person, people think they know him. What more can I do?
Well, yes, when I started, in fact, I say I, but it's my husband, Jung, Hallet, and myself, we did the book together. We divided our research by language. Because I'm Chinese, I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And Jung, unfortunately, who speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. But he speaks Russian, and he spent years working in the Russian archives. Which turned out to be a treasure trove. Both of us relish, you know, working on the original documents, being the historical detective, and find out about a character. And both of us love to deal with a character who makes decisions, who makes policies that, you know, decides the fate of this gigantic country.
Yeah, and with Jenny, I think it's very true of your writing that you get a feel for the time. I mean, you know, particularly reading about Hogarth, you can smell the fetid streets that he used to walk. I mean, that's a beautiful gift to have.
Well, I think that I'm very interested in artists and writers and makers of things, and so often you read a book or even you hear a piece of music and you think, where does that come from? Where does it come from in the person? And then William Hogarth, who did the wonderful Prince of the Rake's Progress and things, and every time I wanted to find out about 18th century life in England, or even what shoes they wore, or what they were doing, or the fairground, I would look at these prints by Hogarth, and then I thought, well, who is this man? And he turns out to be a very stroppy little kind of Cockney Londoner, and he couldn't write. He was dyslexic. He was hopeless at writing, so he didn't leave any letters. So you had to sort of find out about him from his work and from what other people said. And because he, like other people out there, he was actually describing the world he lived in, that was wonderful. Just without effort, somehow you're writing about power, or you're writing about domestic life, or you were writing about struggles of artists, and you were writing about London and how it grew, and the sort of anger that ordinary people felt. So it just comes, I think very often those kinds of artists and writers, they're expressing their world. It's the only way they can, it's the way they can actually deal with real change, real problems that are going on. I mean, to put it into their art, and so the world is just there.
Yeah, I mean, Hogarth is famous for showing us, lifting, you know, this veil and showing us in pictures what England was like at the time. And pictures are just such an important. They're either a stumbling block or a help. I mean, with you it was a help, but with you, I guess, Lucy, it may have been a stumbling block, because Cleopatra. I mean, she's everywhere. She's on casinos in Vegas. She's in Asterix comics. She's you know, she's in books. She's in cartoons. She's everywhere. And you had to somehow put all of that out of your mind and actually build a real woman.
No, I didn't do that, actually. You can't build the real Cleopatra because none of us have any idea what she was like. All the sources for the numerous plays, poems, films that have been based on her story are actually based on the propaganda of her enemies. And the whole story about Cleopatra as this irresistibly beautiful woman who led astray by seducing two of the great Roman heroes, first Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony. That's just a kind of, as it were, black propaganda put around by Mark Antony's political rival, the man who was to go on to become the Emperor Augustus. And somehow, by mistake, Octavius, as he was then called, Octavius's propagandists created the image of Cleopatra as a woman so irresistibly beautiful that when Octavius finally got to meet her after her defeat, he stood with his back turned, because if he caught a glimpse of her for even 1 second, he would have been driven mad by passion, as you know, the people on his side claimed Antony had been, and would become, as according to him, Antony had become unfit to rule Rome. So my book on Cleopatra was, it wasn't about a real woman at all. It was about the way that you can take a story and do absolutely anything you like with it. You can make it into the vehicle for any kind of ideological message you want to carry. And so I looked at what had been done to Cleopatra over 2,000 years. And naturally, Cleopatra, from the point of view of the West, of Europe, was seen as being the incarnation of the foreigner, the dangerous Oriental, who is terrifically seductive and fascinating, but, you know, not to be relied upon. So there's a racial story, there's also a story about sexual politics. She was a woman in power, and for most of the 2,000 years since her lifetime, that has seemed like a very, very threatening kind of a figure. So I find myself, I knew I'd be writing about race and sex when I embarked on that book. What surprised me once I got into the research was to find myself writing about the ethics of suicide, for instance. Cleopatra killed herself. And for medieval writers, that was far and away the most interesting thing, because for Christians, suicide is a sin. But on the other hand, in the Greek and Roman tradition, committing suicide at a moment of defeat demonstrates that you are a person of honor. So there's a sort of odd tension between classical honor and Christian virtue. So following one person, Cleopatra, I find myself going off into all sorts of rather interesting directions.
You say you didn't, you weren't looking for the real woman, and it was hard because of all this blizzard of propaganda, and black propaganda, as you put it. Do you think that any of us actually find the real person? It's just one of those interesting things, because we're, Jenny, just following shreds and shards and other people's accounts, unless you've got diaries, in which case you've also got somebody's own, personal propaganda of themselves. How close can you get to the real person, do you think?
Well, each subject is fantastically different. So with Hogarth, I think that you could get close because he fought so many. He fought with everybody. He annoyed people, and he was against the government, against pretension, against hypocrisy. So all his prints are like his little letters. That's what he drew. That's how he expressed himself. So you can get close. Not quite by description, but by setting him in the context and by seeing what other people said and seeing the arguments that are going on. Other people I also wrote about, I do tend to like difficult, stroppy people who will attack the establishment. And another person I wrote about was Elizabeth Gaskell, the novelist, and that was fascinating because she was a woman in Manchester at the start of the Industrial Revolution. She wanted to speak. She said, I want to speak for the people who elbow me in the street, the people who couldn't speak for themselves, and to show their world so that people would understand and to sort of stop the tension and stop the exploitation. And she got into a lot of trouble for it. But she was completely different because she was an unstoppable letter writer and a great gossip. So there the danger was almost that you were going to be a ventriloquist because her letters are so funny that she sort of spoke for herself. And you had to describe the world. So I think you'd agree that every subject is different. You have to have a different approach.
And also with sort of the Dowager Empress, I keep coming back to this, people think they know, and largely people had been rather unkind about her, and that wasn't the person that you discovered.
Well, I think I'm extremely lucky to have two absolutely unique subjects who were both the most powerful people in China, in modern Chinese history. Mao, it goes without saying. The Empress Dowager actually founded modern China. She ruled China between 1861 and 1908. She was the person who brought modernity into a medieval China and gave us everything from the electric light to the railways to the modern army and navy to banning the bound feet and the educational system, the legal system, and abolishing, things like death by 1,000 cuts, which was basically to slowly slice somebody to death, which was prescribed punishment before she came over. Now, so about them, the general world perception, you may say, had been totally wrong.
Well, let's be blunt about it. They said that she was steeped in blood, she was a callous murderer of anyone who challenged her position, she bumped off
Yes.
members of family quite happily. I mean, there was a very different narrative that was out there, wasn't
That's
there?
right.
Yeah.
And of course, the first thing they always say, it's like Lucy's point. You have a woman ruler, and the story was always she was incredibly beautiful, and she had these sexual tricks, and which lured her husband into favoring her. In fact, as we I did this on myself, and as I found out, from the archives, because about her, the archives were open, and 10 million documents from the Forbidden City archives, and etc. She actually wasn't very good looking. I mean, she was very good looking, but she wasn't absolutely stunning. And her husband, the emperor, didn't actually favor her. She had been chosen during one of those periodic nationwide selections for imperial concubines, and she was installed as she caught the eye of her husband. That's true. I mean, she had expressive eyes, and she was installed as a low-rank concubine. Her husband actually didn't like her because she was interested in politics, and she wanted to give him advice on how to cope his problems of foreign invasion, mainly by the British, and the peasant uprisings sweeping China. But her husband didn't like that because women were not allowed to have views. And so her husband wrote a decree, actually, and gave the decree to the empress and said, if I die, and if she is attempting to interfere in politics, you are going to show this decree and put her to death. So she wasn't her husband's favorite, but she born the only son to the emperor.
Which is I mean, even now, sad to say, even in this part of the world, is an enormous currency. You bring forth a boy and you are,
yes, and last thing about her is when her husband died as a result of British invasion, she promptly launched a coup with the empress, her best friend, and facing death by 1,000 cuts, and seized the power and began to rule China.
I just want to come back to you, Lucy, because I think your book is fascinating because it really highlights a problem that anyone who writes about women faces, which is this sort of the perception problem. Because I mean, I found when I was writing 2 heaps of cuttings, one where my subject, who was an Indian princess suffragette woman, is beautiful and graceful and lovely, and then suddenly it's like a harlot, a whore, a problem, and you know, the extremists of coverage, because men had the newspapers, they had the books, they had the history. It's really interesting to have women now doing this, but they have a lot to contend with, don't they?
Yes, but actually men are subject to it too. I mean, the book I wrote after my Cleopatra book is called Heroes, and it was about 8 male figures, people who, whether they deserved it or not, had been the object of hero worship. And in nearly every one of those cases, and I chose examples, well, I began with the Trojan War, with Achilles, and then came right up into the beginning of the 20th century. And in nearly each case, you would have a kind of a front man, a person who becomes enormously popular with the public. And very often behind the scenes, that front man is being manipulated by somebody else. And I mean, one example was the Elizabethan sailor Francis Drake, who was a pirate, basically, a bit of a scallywag, really not a very respectable person. But when he came back, having sailed around the world, in the course of which he'd attacked completely illegally the ships of Spain, with which England was not then at war, stolen the equivalent of millions and millions of pounds worth of goods from these Spanish ships. He arrived back in England, and there were 2 things that could have happened to him at that point. One was he could have been flung into prison for the rest of his life, or even executed for his absolutely brazen defiance of all laws, both national and international. Or he could be adopted as a national hero. And Queen Elizabeth Queen Elizabeth I of England and her very canny advisors opted for the latter. They decided that, you know, rather than disown Drake, they would acclaim him. And that way, they could say, oh, he was doing all this for his country, which meant that he'd have to hand over all the treasure to the National Treasury. So he lost his money, but he acquired a heroic reputation. And there are many examples of that. I mean,
that's a lovely, lovely double-edged sword. You know, we give you credit, we take all credit from you. Can we just talk about the passions for your subject as well? Because with Mbeki, he's not a bundle of laughs. I mean, is he? I mean, I was really interested. There was something I read where it said he never ate in your presence.
Yes, that's right.
And he wasn't a very relaxed subject. So how did you
he agreed to, and it wasn't an authorized biography, but I made the decision I wasn't going to do it without his cooperation. And he agreed to cooperate, which was great, because it meant he, you know, at the time particularly within the African National Congress, with its Stalinist tradition, no one was going to talk to me if the chief didn't say they could talk to me. So to get that was wonderful. And I landed up spending a total of about 20 hours with him, which is more than anybody else has. I mean, he was very aloof and distant. Again, something Nehruvian about him. And there was, the longest time I had with him was about 5 hours. And he was, you know, incredibly diligent, answered every single one of my questions very thoughtfully. But in those 5 hours, he didn't break bread with me. He refused to break bread with me. And a couple of times, you know, out of the depths of the State House, a flunky would arrive wheeling a tray of those sort of fried foods that you get in state houses, and he would wave them away. And I'd be like, no, don't go. I'm hungry. And eventually I stopped the interview because I needed to go to the toilet.
Right.
I was worried that if I even stood up to relieve myself, he'd disappear into the bowels of this obscure state house. And he never broke bread with me. And I guess if I were ever in the position where somebody was coming to write a biography of me because I was an important person, I might feel the same way. I mean, I think that there's one of my favorite writers on biography is the brilliant essayist Janet Malcolm. And one of the things that Janet Malcolm says in her book about the way Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath have been biographized is that there is always betrayal in the act of biography. There has to be, because you will never see your subject the way your subject sees him or herself, or the way your subject's descendants, the people who have given you access to the papers, if they're still around, see him or her.
I mean, Janet Malcolm, though, is a really interesting person to bring up, because in the Freud archive, she ends up painting a loathsome picture of a man who, at the beginning, you think is going to be quite heroic. You know, he's sort of rescued the Freud papers, he's been really sort of a flamboyant man, and you can tell she kind of detests him at the end, and you detest him at the end. I think he felt so detested he launched a legal action against her when the book came out. Did you, with Mbeki, did you end up liking him or not at the end of this process?
No,
you didn't like him.
I never liked him much. Yeah. I was hoping I would, but I was also involved in this very strange process, which I would never repeat, which is that I was writing about him as his power was advancing. So I started writing about him as he came to power, and I published my book as he was deposed, because he was deposed. And so I was working in these two time zones. You know, I was in the present where he was amassing power and unpopularity, particularly around certain things like his refusal to accept that HIV causes AIDS. Yeah. And at the same time, I was drilling these wells into the past to try and imagine the fresh youth, the callow youth, the likable youth, the idealistic young man. And these two images of this person kept on clashing with each other. I wondered, Jung, whether you had the same thing, whether there were times in your research of Mao that you loved him and you were able to find the love for him when he was young and idealistic.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, this is also back to your earlier question, whether one can get into your subject's head. In fact, I think it's a biographer's job to get into the head of your subjects. So I certainly feel that we got into Mao's head, and I got into the Empress Dowager's head, and in a way that I understand, I can predict what he would do. And of course, it's all based on the documents. And also, I was also noticing that your researching process, because of course, Jung and I spent 12 years researching Mao, but we traveled around the world. Apart from doing the archives, we traveled around the world and interviewed nearly everybody who had interesting dealings with Mao, from Henry Kissinger, George Bush to the Dalai Lama. We came here, and in Dharamsala, we interviewed Indian people who are close to Nehru, who had very interesting dealings with Mao. And if I may tell one story.
Go on, go on.
Well, because we had many riveting stories, but there is one which was the African dictator Mobutu. Do you remember this? The tyrant of Zaire, now Congo. He also had a very interesting dealing with Mao, and we wanted to interview him. And one day, Jung and I were in Hong Kong after doing 2-month interviews in China, 2 months research in China. We're in Hong Kong. In the morning, Jung was reading his morning paper, and he suddenly yelled. He said, "Guess who is in this hotel? It's Mobutu." And he said, "Shall we try to find somebody to introduce us?" And I said, "Oh, Jung, I can't be bothered. I've done 2-month interviews. I'm exhausted. I'm going to the hair salon." So I went to the hair salon, and 10 minutes later, who but Mobutu strutted in. He was sitting like where Mark is. He was under this hair thing. He had bits of cotton wools around his head, bits of towels around his neck, and he was trapped. And so when I was there to have my hair rinsed, I was able to approach him, and he agreed. And so we had absolutely unique.
I love that story. Yeah.
And I don't think I have enough time, but we also had a 5-hour encounter with Imelda Marco.
I tell you what, I mean, that's now, if any would be biographers out there, just go to the salon. But I want you all to just for a moment have a little bit of biographer's envy, because you, Kate, you actually had tapes of your subject's voice, and I have such huge envy and jealousy about this, because first of all, there's this Jo Carstairs story which is unknown to most people, and you've dug it out, but then to have her tell her own story with her own voice, God, that must have been great.
It was, and quite unexpected. I started on the book as a kind of perverse experiment, because I could see that she was actually the perfect obituary subject, because she was a woman of action, and everything that mattered about her life, that as she would have thought of it, was contained in what she did. She built a kingdom, she made rules, she raced boats, she was very physical, practical. She didn't write, she was completely unliterary, so there were no records, she didn't write letters to friends even. So it was a kind of perverse project to try to write something about this woman who didn't really think she had an inner life, and to try to find a way of telling her story from the inside, even though it would have been something that I suspected she would have resisted. And so it was kind of crazy. I started by trying to find the things that she'd loved, the boats, the cars, and a little leather doll who she kept by her side, who I discovered had actually been cremated with her, who was her sort of alter ego. And I was astonished to find, and overjoyed, one of her friends said, "Oh, she made some tapes for somebody who was going to write her biography." And there was a set of, I think, a dozen tapes where she talked about her life. And I realized then how insane my original project had actually been, because I was going to write a whole book about her without a word from her, either written or spoken. But suddenly I had a wealth of anecdotes, and as I suspected, she hated self-reflection. And if anyone of her friend, her interviewer, said to her, "But why did you do that?" she'd say, there's no why.
Yes.
I did it.
I just did it, yeah.
And she said, I never felt anything about myself. I just was. I was just it.
Yeah. No, it's magnificent. And actually, that's a really interesting thing. Let's all think about that for a moment, because I mean, I certainly found that writing about Sophia Dilip Singh, I thought at the end of it, she would have hated this, because she really hated attention. You know, she was asked for in a Who's Who entry for a description of herself, and she only put one thing: my interest is the advancement of women. And I thought, thanks a bloody lot. That's it. That's all you're going to give me. But I mean, would your subjects have liked what you did for them, or are any of them in your mind, Jenny? They would have turned around and hated you for it.
No, but I'm very interested in that idea of betrayal of a biography, because it's such an impertinence somehow, isn't it, to say that you can tell somebody's life, and even more that you can tell it from within. And you only have to look at the history of biography, or different ages, or certainly Cleopatra, to realise that we're all writing, we're selecting, we're writing a book that is of interest to us, we're interested in the history, you know, the role of women, or action and inner, or power, or hero worship, and that we're making a book out of their lives.
And I feel that to actually start writing, I've got to sort of learn all over again with each book, or accept that this isn't it's my story of them.
Absolutely.
It's not their story. It's not the story of them. It's not their story of them.
But do you not feel the presence of them, that they're always sort of sitting near you? I mean, I was certainly very conscious when I was writing of this is somebody I kind of quite admire. I need to work really hard at getting to the bottom of it's not enough sometimes just to say they did this. I need to really understand why. And one part of me really wanted to love the reason why, and that was sometimes a struggle. I don't know whether you found that.
Yes, I think you can get too close, not to Cleopatra, but I mean D'Annunzio, very, very interesting, complicated subject. I do want to know why, but there are moments of, I want to be as accurate as possible. I'm sure we all want to actually not tell lies, you know, in terms of facts or dates, or, I mean, be accurate. But then you think that you're being dispassionate and close. And I had one experience writing about Elizabeth Gaskell, whom I thought I was treating completely objectively, you know, very respectfully. And I was in an archive where there were a lot of, the Wedgwood archive, there were a lot of letters from one of her closest friends, and they hadn't been catalogued. The women's letters were often not catalogued, and there was a box. And you open the box, and the little folding open letters, and there was a letter from the daughter of her best friend, Fanny Wedgwood, and Gaskell and Fanny were, you know, just great friends. And you opened Snow's letter, and it said, "Oh God, that woman's coming to stay. Everybody knows Mum hates her." And I can feel it now. I was so upset, and I realised that it was because I was actually feeling like her, and that was just said, you know.
And then you need to go and have a shower or something, or wash that out of you, because you do have to sort of keep sort of saying, no, actually I can't be this person. I'm not your friend, I'm telling your story. Let's just talk about some of the things that never made it into books, because, I mean, there are these stacks and stacks of documents and you know, archives and everything else, and tapes and interviews that you go through. There must be one gem that you kick yourself and go, actually, I'd love to, but well, this is your chance to tell the world about it. Lucy, have you got one that comes to mind?
Well, my last book was about Gabriele D'Annunzio, who's, he was a sort of forerunner of Italian fascism, a brilliant poet, terrifically successful seducer of women. When he was in his late 50s, he made himself dictator of a small harbour city in Croatia, which is now called Rijeka, which was then called Fiume. In other words, he had a really, really busy life. I mean, you know, I haven't mentioned the fact that he was a pioneering aviator. He did an awful lot. And there is so much that I couldn't get into my book, which, you know, ended up being a very long book. I mean, just his love life. He died in 1938, and So, you know, not that terribly long ago. And sometimes when I've been at festivals, somebody has put up their hand and say, oh, by the way, I think that D'Annunzio knew my great-great-aunt very well. And I say, no, not another mistress. You know, I've had to cut out so many mistresses. And there are so many people, you know, who are offended on behalf of their great-great-grandmothers because actually D'Annunzio had a lot of women. And so in that case, I mean, you know, when I was writing about Cleopatra, I had almost no documented historical facts. I mean, you know, a few dates of death and birth, that kind of thing. With D'Annunzio, I knew an awful lot because he was a celebrity, really well known all over Europe, from the age of 18 till when he died in his late 70s, so that I was able to describe him from an enormous number of different viewpoints, because if you met D'Annunzio, you immediately went home and wrote in your diary, or you wrote to your best friend saying, I met D'Annunzio last night, and you wouldn't believe it, he's so ugly, how did he get all those women? Or you might write and say, his politics are appalling, which indeed, in my opinion, they are. But he's such a nice man, he's so charming. So he's full of contradictions which people wanted to write about. So I knew a lot about him from very many different standpoints. I mean, when I embarked on a book about D'Annunzio, an Italian poet of the extreme right, I had no idea that I would find myself writing about Franz Kafka. And Kafka, at one point, saw D'Annunzio at an air show and wrote a wonderful description of him trotting around. D'Annunzio was a very small man, trotting around, very sort of shiny. He always had very twinkly little shiny boots. And looking to Kafka's eye, very unimpressive. But so a lot of different other people's eyes on D'Annunzio. But I also had D'Annunzio's own account of himself, because he published an enormous amount of stuff. His collected volumes runs to 38 stout books. But he also kept a notebook in his pocket at all times. And because he was very, very keen on preserving everything that he seemed to himself frightfully important. And so he devoted the last 18 years of his life to, as it were, creating his own archive. And all his notebooks are still there. And I mean, you certainly don't trust anything D'Annunzio published. He was a great self-mythologizer. You don't trust anything he said in his letters, because he was always busy glorifying himself, even when writing to his close friends. But his notebooks I do trust. And from reading them, I mean, you know, I couldn't get inside Cleopatra's head at all, but I can certainly get inside D'Annunzio's head. I know what he was reading. I know what he was thinking about what he was reading. I know what he was eating. He really didn't like asparagus, but he loved oranges. And I know everything that he did in bed, to an extent which is really quite embarrassing.
But I love that. I mean, I think we all have had that feeling of, please, not another fact. I cannot take another fact about this person because I've just put this chapter to bed. Can I just ask both of you, and we're going to take some questions. So if you put up your hands, let me just get mics to people. If you'd like to ask a question, put your hands up very clearly in one of these lovely, there's one in the front here, and let's take one from the back. If you put your hands up really clearly. Okay, we'll get a mic to you in a moment. Is there one that got away? Or?
Well, no, what I wanted to say was I was really struck by what Paul Theroux said about House for Mr. Biswas in that session on Naipaul a couple of days ago, where he said what makes that book so extraordinary is that it's a whole life. It begins with Mr. Biswas was born, and it ends with Mr. Biswas died. And you can do that in fiction, because it's fiction. And I think one of the problems with biographers, and particularly male biographers, is that we try and do that in our biographies too. So my first edition of the Mbeki book was 1,000 pages long. And you can't, because there is no way we can, it all swims away. I mean, what we've caught are these scraps and these oughts and these fragments. And we're kind of, Jenny, you're quite right, it's an act of imagination, biography. I mean, it's based on evidence. It's like finding a little Etruscan shard and imagining a whole civilization. That's the archaeology of it. but it is an active imagination.
Does anyone else want to, just before we take oh, you've got another question there, great. We're going to take a question here, but I want you all just to think about, it's Jenny started this off, it's lovely, that one thing that you found, just have a think about it, I won't come to you now, that just made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you couldn't believe your luck. Let's take a couple of questions here first. Yeah.
Thank you. I attended an earlier session here, which was Selfie, the art of the memoir, and now we're doing the art of biography, and my untutored mind is completely confused about the differences, the major differences between the two disciplines.
Okay, that's a lovely question. Who would like to take that?
What is it, the art of...
What's the difference between the art of memoir and the art of biography? Because the lady in the front is confused about it. Go on, do you want Mark to have a stab?
Well, I mean, purely technically, the memoir is about yourself and the biography is about someone else. But as someone, I was on the yeah.
Oh, what's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? Oh, I'm not sure. Yeah, Jenny, do you want to? Yeah.
Well, I think a memoir can simply be a fragment. It doesn't have to say, I am telling the story of my life. A memoir can be, they're very often about childhood. My childhood growing up in a small village, or my memories of famous people I have known, or something like that. So they're not quite so personal, I think, as an autobiography.
I'd say, in a way, it would be good to have the equivalent sort of distinction in biography, in that autobiography does suggest, as you say, sort of cradle to grave and covering the ground, and memoir suggests something more impressionistic and selective. But I think biographies can also be like memoirs. They can take an episode, and in fact, since my first book, I would say my books they've had biographical elements in them, but they're not straight biographies. They centre on episodes in lives and the ramifications of those episodes and the world around them. So they're not about an individual from start to end. And I would, I'd suggest that that's kind of the difference between memoir and...
Jenny, you want to? Yeah.
Yes, just very quickly, because of what Lucy said. I think if you're a biographer, you don't always trust a memoir. You have to take them with a pinch of salt. This is just what Lucy said about D'Annunzio and his many memoirs.
Okay, and Jung, and then can someone get a mic to the gentleman at the front while Jung's answering? Just here, yeah.
Well, I think because I wrote Wild Swans, is it an autobiography or is it a memoir? Sorry. Yes. Well, the thing is, it's not cradle to grave. I hope I'm a long way to grave.
Long way. Yeah.
and also there is my grandmother's stories, my mother's stories, and my stories, and so I would not call it autobiography. I think maybe I'll just say but I wouldn't call it a memoir either, because it's not memoir. It's the story of these 3 generations of women. But now that I have the floor, may I grab the opportunity to answer your earlier question?
God, yes. Go on, yeah.
No, what I've left out of this, the writing. I mean, in our Mao biography, because my husband and I spent 12 years researching, I mean, our research process is most riveting, as we interviewed nearly everybody who is interested in dealings with Mao. And so if I may mention one other person, I think from this region or near here, which is Imelda Marcos, the former first lady of the Philippines, who had thousands of pairs of shoes. And we spent 5 hours with her, and she was in full flow. And she had a very interesting dealing with Mao, because Mao was a womanizer. And when he saw Imelda, Mao was nearly blind, but his eyes sparkled as he saw this. They saw these women, gloriously dressed, and so he was shaking. He picked up Imelda's hand and put it to his lips. And this gesture, the kissing, or the gallant kissing of a woman's hand, was condemned in the Cultural Revolution, which was the time, as a bourgeois habit. Any man man who did that would have been subjected to one of those ghastly denunciation meetings. So Mao's photographer, whom we interviewed, didn't dare to take a photograph. But luckily for us, the newsreel camera kept rolling and recorded this moment. So we have a unique photo of a rapt Mao flirting with Imelda in our book. And so during our interview, Imelda furiously batted her eyelids at Jung, my Jung, and then she turned to me and said, "Oh, you know, Western men simply don't understand us Eastern women." So Jung said, "Have you come across a Western man who understands you?" And she said, "Only one person, Richard Nixon." Unfortunately, stories like these didn't manage to get into trouble.
That's why sessions like these are so important, because you do get to hear things you wouldn't. Have we got another question ready to go? Yes, do stand up. Yeah.
What are the main obstructions do you face while writing a biography?
The main, the main obstacles. Okay, what are the main obstacles in writing it? Do you want to take that, Kate?
In writing
biographies,
biography?
yeah.
Well, the main obstacles I faced, as I say, was a sort of apparent lack of material, but that was an obstacle I kind of set myself. For me, I like to have subjects where there seems at first to be hardly anything. So I have the sort of momentum of a detective adventure of just trying to find anything out. So there are biographers who take on very richly documented. I mean, I think most people here have taken on sort of very big figures who have been much written about, and a lot of the difficulty must be in editing it down, in actually selecting and shaping. But I like to have a really literal difficulty in knowing anything at the beginning and having to spend a lot of time in archives or making phone calls, just trying to get those first bits together. And it's the sort of thrill of the chase, but a sort of archival chase, more often than not.
Lucy, what's been the biggest obstacle for you?
Well, I think the difficulty with writing a biography is finding the right structure. And traditional biographies, I mean, you know, the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century biographies, very often begin with the subject's birth and end with his or her death, and they plod straight through year by year by year, telling you, you know, who did he have tea with, so forth. And so, you know, the first thing you have to do is get away from that. I mean, that is boring. And so then, I mean, in some ways, it's much easier than writing fiction, which is what I'm trying to do now. But because, you know, that you do have material, you have a story to tell. So you've got that as a kind of armature for whatever sculpture you're going to put on it. But you still have to decide where to begin and end, and you know, birth and death can't be the answers to those questions, because that just doesn't work anymore. Readers are more demanding and should be. So I spent a lot of time with my D'Annunzio book trying to decide where to begin it. And for a long time, I thought that I had to start with the biggest adventure of his life, which was when he made himself dictator, this small place in Croatia. But I couldn't write the first sentence, because for my readers to understand the first sentence, they needed to know an awful lot of stuff, which I couldn't cram into that one sentence. It would have had to have had 100 subordinate clauses. So in the end, I decided to begin with the First World War, because most people have heard of the First World War. So if I sort of situated D'Annunzio, not the same thing, in that kind of story, then that would, you know, readers would recognize it, they'd know where they were. But then, actually, that didn't work either. So I wrote a new first chapter to go before what then became the second chapter, in which I told the whole story of D'Annunzio's life, because I thought, actually, people can't really understand this book at all unless they know the entire narrative before we begin. And of course, that seems absurd, but it very often is the case. I mean, people love hearing stories they've heard before. You know, there are more biographies of Napoleon written in Europe anyway, than there are of any other person. And everyone knows how that story ends. And when a biographer of Napoleon writes, he decided to invade Russia. Most people know just about enough history to think, this is going to end badly, and the writer can work on that. Whereas my readers didn't really know what was going to happen to D'Annunzio, so I had to tell them straight up before I could start playing with the kind of the ironies of the different situations.
Thank you, thanks. We have one question there at the back. Could you stand up for us as well, because then we can see you. Yeah, pass the mic over. Yes, you with this headscarf. Yes, it really is you. It's your turn. There we go. Great.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Sandy. Question is for Kate Summerscale. I went to a session yesterday on adaptations of fiction into movies, and I wanted to know what involvement you had and how you felt about the adaptation of Mr. Witcher to the TV series.
Yeah. Well, I was, first of all, thrilled and excited that it made it to, it was adapted. A lot of books get optioned, and it very often comes up, the raising of the money to put it in. So first of all, the production company adapted the book itself, The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, and which I thought they did a really good job, very kind of respectful of the period and the material and the truth of it. It's a true story, not a novel, and there was a slight sort of documentary, there was a feel for that, a frisson that came from that. And then, to my astonishment, they also made a series of films in which Mr. Witcher became a fictional detective, and he started to solve crimes that were made up for him by the production company and the scriptwriters. And I had no direct involvement. I wasn't a consultant. I had no power of veto, but they involved me. They, invited me along to watch some filming and some editing, and it was fun. I was like a tourist watching, and I really enjoyed the main actor, Paddy Considine's portrayal of Witcher, and it was very exciting to have. And part of my interest in the murder story that was the basis for the book, and in Jack Witcher himself, the detective, was when I saw that this murder mystery and this detective had fed into the beginnings of detective fiction, and that Witcher was a kind of prototype for all the detectives, or many of the detectives that have come since. So there was something really delightful and ironic about the fact that I'd written this factual book, which had a sort of fictional shape to it, but was entirely factual, I hope, and now it was feeding into a new sort of series of fictional stories, and Witcher had in his own right become a kind of made-up detective, even though he was a real person.
Yeah,
and
they do very well. I mean, there's, I think they were running just before I left. They were running on a channel. So that's fantastic. So I'm just waiting for the person. Roddy, how long have we got? Have we got any time left at all? No. Got no time left at all?
Yes, I think.
Well, one of you can give me one spine-chilling anecdote, either about the thing that you found, I mean, like the Marcos thing, or anyone want to take that, or the one thing that you left out that you wished you'd put in? Anyone want to take that? No?
I've got it on the Witcher subject.
Go on.
I've just been talking about that.
Go on.
It wasn't something I consciously left out, just didn't know about, but this is something that can happen with writing non-fiction that's really exciting, I find, is that it's real. And so there can be things that other people out there know that you don't when you're writing your book. And after that Mr. Witcher was originally published, I had letters with new information, and one of which was, none of which changed the story, thank God, changed the outcome. But somebody wrote to say, did you know there's a picture of him, of Jonathan Witcher, in a public library? I think it was in Woking. And I was, amazed and quite nervous because I had described him based on descriptions of him by Charles Dickens, who'd met him in 1850. But, you know, a bit paraphrased and interpreted. And so I went rather with my heart in my mouth to see the photographs, and was very pleased. He was something like I'd described. I was very pleased to see, and looked extremely likable and charming. And I was able to include the pictures in another edition of the book.
Yeah.
And so it was sometimes when you're writing biography, or when I sort of forget it's true, because you spend so much time shaping it and working on it, and then to have these kind of reminders from out there.
So this face looking back at you saying, you did all right, Kate. Well, unfortunately, that is all that we have time for, but please join with me in thanking our fantastic panel today. They will be signing books in the book tent. Thank you very much.
Thanks again to all our authors for this event.